I was standing at attention in my dress blues diploma in hand cameras flashing all around me, and the 2 seats reserved for my parents in the front row were empty. That night, while I was still in my uniform, my sister posted a photo online. Balloons, a cake with white frosting, my parents laughing, my mother cradling our family dog in her arms like a newborn. The caption read, "Best birthday ever." I stared at that photo for almost 10 minutes before I understood something that changed the rest of my life. The dog's birthday mattered more to them than mine ever had. My name is Zoe Campbell. I'm a major in the United States Army, and for most of my life I believed that if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, made myself impressive enough, my parents would finally look at me the way they looked at my younger sister Emily. It took me 30 years to understand that no accomplishment was ever going to buy me that look. It simply wasn't for sale. I grew up in a house that smelled like fresh flowers and old money in a town where our last name meant something. My father, Richard Campbell, built a real estate empire from nothing, and he made sure everyone knew it. My mother, Linda, ran our household like a stage production, always aware of who might be watching. And from the time I was old enough to understand the difference between being loved and being tolerated, I understood that Emily was the star of that production, and I was somewhere in the background holding a prop. I remember being 12 years old, standing in the kitchen with a certificate in my hand. I'd won the top academic award in my grade out of the entire school. I ran home breathless, certain that this would be the moment. My father looked at it, nodded once, and went back to his newspaper. 2 weeks later, Emily brought home a participation ribbon from a spelling bee she hadn't even placed in, and my mother threw a small party. There were balloons that time, too. I stood in the corner of our dining room, 8 years old and confused, wondering what exactly I had done wrong. It never stopped. Not in middle school, not in high school, not when I got into a strong university, not when I decided against everyone's quiet disapproval to commission into the Army instead of pursuing some safer, softer career that would look better at my parents' dinner parties. My father never said he was proud of me. He said things like, "That's an unusual choice for someone like you," and "I hope you know what you're doing." Emily, meanwhile, could barely hold down a retail job for 6 months, and my parents called her a free spirit finding her way. Then I met Daniel. Daniel Brooks was nothing like the men my parents had been quietly introducing me to since I was 22. He was the son of an electrician, and he taught high school history in a public school 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of job that came with grading papers on Friday nights, and a salary that made my mother's eyebrow twitch the first time she asked about it at dinner. But Daniel was steady. He listened when I spoke, instead of waiting for his turn to talk. He remembered small things about me that I hadn't even realized mattered until he brought them up months later. He made me laugh in a way that felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. My parents hated him immediately. I still remember sitting in my father's study, the smell of leather and old cigars thick in the air, when he told me plainly, without even the courtesy of softening it, "Our family doesn't marry people like him." Not, "We're worried about you," or "Tell us more about him." Just a flat statement like he was talking about hiring the wrong contractor for a building project. I remember the way my chest tightened, the way I had to consciously unclench my jaw before I could speak. I told him I was marrying Daniel regardless of what he thought, and my father simply said, "Then you're on your own," and went back to his paperwork the same way he'd gone back to his newspaper all those years ago with my certificate. They came to the wedding. I'll give them that. They sat in the second row, my mother in a pale blue dress, my father in a suit that probably cost more than Daniel's entire first year of teaching salary, and they smiled for the photos because appearances mattered more to them than almost anything else. But afterward, at every family gathering, every holiday dinner, my father found a way to remind me, "You married beneath yourself, Zoe." He said it so many times over the years that it stopped even sounding like an insult to him. It was just a fact he stated the way you'd mention the weather. I told myself I could live with it. I told myself that my career, my marriage, My own quiet version of happiness would eventually be enough to drown out his voice. I was wrong about that too. The advanced officer training program I completed years later was one of the hardest things I had ever done physically and mentally. 14-hour days, weeks away from Daniel, moments where I genuinely questioned whether I had anything left to give. When I finally stood on that stage in front of my peers in front of the flag, I wanted more than almost anything in my life for my parents to be there to see it. They told me they would come. I believed them because some small stubborn part of me still hadn't learned. I kept looking at those 2 empty seats throughout the entire ceremony, telling myself they were running late, telling myself there had been traffic, an emergency, something reasonable. There wasn't. There was a dog's birthday party with balloons and a cake with white frosting posted online for the whole world to see, time-stamped the exact hour I was receiving my diploma. That night I didn't cry. I didn't call and scream at them. I did something quieter and, in its own way, far more permanent. I picked up my phone and one by one I blocked every number. No calls, no emails, no letters, no social media. Complete and total silence on my end and theirs. 5 years passed that way. Then my phone rang. A number I hadn't seen in half a decade lit up my screen. Arthur Benson, my father's longtime attorney. I almost didn't answer. Some old tired part of me wanted to let it ring out the way I'd let 5 years of birthdays and holidays ring out. But something made me pick up. "Your father needs one signature," Arthur said, his voice careful, almost apologetic. "Tell him he lost that privilege 5 years ago," I said, and I meant every word of it. There was a pause on the other end, longer than I expected. "Please," Arthur said quietly. "Just hear me out." Arthur Benson had known my father for over 20 years, and in all that time he'd never once called me directly. Every interaction I'd had with him growing up had gone through my father, first a filtered, formal kind of contact that always felt more like business than family. So when he asked if he could come to my house in person to talk, I felt something shift in my chest. Not hope, exactly. Something more like caution. I told him yes, before I had time to talk myself out of it. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon in late spring, driving a dark sedan that looked out of place on our quiet street where the driveways were cracked and the fences leaned slightly from years of wind and weather. I watched him through the front window as he parked, straightened his jacket, and looked up at our house with an expression I couldn't quite place. Surprise, maybe, or something closer to reassessment. Daniel was outside when Arthur pulled up, sleeves rolled to his elbows, replacing a fence post that had rotted through over the winter. He wiped his hands on his jeans and shook Arthur's hand with the easy warmth that came so naturally to him, the same warmth that had once made my father sneer with disdain. Arthur shook his hand back, and I saw something flicker across his face, a kind of quiet observation, like he was recalibrating something he'd believed for a long time. We sat at our kitchen table, the same table Daniel had built himself the year we moved in, sanded and stained on weekends after long days of teaching. I made coffee, nothing fancy, just the coffee we drank every morning. Arthur looked around at our small kitchen, at the photos on the refrigerator, at the modest, lived-in comfort of our home, and I could tell he was searching for something he expected to find, and hadn't. "You have a nice life here," he said finally, and I couldn't tell if it was an observation or an apology. "We do," I said. "It's ours." He nodded slowly, then reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, the kind of document packet that immediately makes your stomach tighten before you even read the first page. He slid it across the table toward me. "Your father needs your signature on this," he said. "It's related to some estate matters. Your grandfather's trust." "What kind of estate matters?" "It's mostly paperwork," Arthur said, and there was something in the way he said it, too smooth, too rehearsed, that made the hair on my arms stand up. "A formality, really. Richard just needs to update some of the trust documentation, and your signature is required as one of the beneficiaries." I opened the folder and began to read. "I want to be honest about something here. I've spent years learning to read carefully to catch details that others miss, whether it was a supply manifest that didn't add up or a training report that had been quietly altered before it crossed my desk. The Army teaches you that details matter, that the difference between disaster and safety is often buried in a single overlooked line. So when I started reading through that document, I wasn't reading it the way my father assumed I would. He expected the daughter who used to accept whatever he handed her without question. He didn't know that daughter didn't exist anymore. The language was dense, deliberately so filled with legal phrasing that seemed designed to discourage careful reading rather than invite it. There were references to waiver of beneficiary interest and restructuring of distributive shares, and clauses that seemed to circle around each other without ever quite saying plainly what they meant. I read one paragraph 3 times and still couldn't tell you in plain English what it was actually asking me to give up. Arthur sat across from me, his fingers tapping lightly against his coffee cup, a small unconscious rhythm of impatience. Every few minutes he'd glance at his watch, then catch himself and look back up at me with a practiced, patient smile. "Take your time," he said, though his tone suggested the opposite. "I intend to," I said. I kept reading. The more I read, the more something in my gut told me this wasn't the simple formality Arthur was describing. There was a section buried on the 4th page discussing an adjustment to primary distribution percentages that seemed to shift significant weight away from equal shares. Equal shares between who exactly the document didn't say plainly. It was written in a way that assumed I would sign quickly, trust the process, trust my father the way I used to. I looked up at Arthur. "This says my grandfather established this trust, not my father." "That's correct," Arthur said. "Your father has managed it on behalf of the beneficiaries since his passing." "Managed it," I repeated. "Not owned it." "Correct." "Then why does he need my signature to change how it's distributed if he doesn't have authority to change it in the first place?" Arthur paused just slightly too long before answering. "It's a bit more complicated than that. There are provisions that allow for adjustment with beneficiary consent." "Whose consent specifically?" He didn't answer that one directly, and that silence told me more than anything he could have said out loud. I closed the folder slowly and slid it back toward him. "I'm not signing this today," I said. "Zoe, your father was hoping this could be resolved quickly. There's a bit of time sensitivity involved." "I understand," I said, and I meant it in a way he probably didn't intend. I understood perfectly. Whatever this was, someone wanted it signed fast before I had the chance to look too closely, and I had spent enough years learning to recognize urgency used as a pressure tactic to know exactly what I was looking at. "I'll have my own attorney read this," I said, "before I sign anything." For the first time since he'd walked through my door, Arthur looked genuinely caught off guard. Not offended, not defensive, just quietly, visibly surprised, as if the idea that I might not simply comply had never occurred to him or to the man who had sent him. I found my own attorney within the week. Her name was Patricia Alvarez, a sharp, methodical woman who had handled estate disputes for over 15 years and had the kind of quiet confidence that made you trust her within the first 5 minutes of conversation. I handed her the folder Arthur had left with me and told her everything. The timeline, the pressure, the vague language that seemed built to discourage careful reading. She called me 4 days later. "Zoe," she said, "I need you to sit down for this." I was standing in my kitchen when she called, dish towel still in my hand, and something about her tone made me lower myself into a chair anyway. "Your grandfather," she began, "established a trust nearly 30 years ago. It's very specifically structured, and I want to walk you through exactly what it says because I don't think your father expected either you or your sister to ever actually read the founding documents." She explained that my grandfather, a man I remembered only faintly, mostly as a quiet presence at holiday dinners, who preferred fishing to conversation, had set aside a significant portion of his estate in a trust meant explicitly for his grandchildren. Not for his son, not for Richard. For me and Emily, split evenly to be distributed under specific conditions outlined in the original trust documents. My father had been named trustee responsible for managing the assets responsibly on our behalf until certain conditions were met. But management, Patricia explained carefully, was not ownership. He had discretion over investment decisions and distributions within very narrow guidelines. What he did not have under any circumstance outlined in the original document was the authority to unilaterally change the division of the trust itself. So what was I being asked to sign? I asked, though some part of me had already started putting the pieces together. A voluntary waiver, Patricia said. Essentially, you signing away a significant portion of your beneficiary interest, restructuring the split so that your sister would receive the overwhelming majority of the trust's value upon final distribution. I sat there in my kitchen, the dish towel still damp in my hand, and I felt something strange happen inside my chest. Not rage, not the hot immediate anger I might have expected. Something colder and somehow clearer. Why would he need my signature at all? I asked slowly. If he's just the trustee, couldn't he just distribute it however he wanted? Because the original trust explicitly protects equal division unless both beneficiaries agree otherwise in writing, Patricia said. Your father can't simply decide to give Emily more. The only way that happens is if you sign away your share voluntarily, which is likely why there was pressure to move quickly and why the language in that document was written the way it was. It's designed to obscure exactly what you'd be giving up. I thought about Emily's birthday parties. I thought about the participation ribbon, the balloons, the dog's birthday cake with white frosting, time-stamped the exact hour I stood on that stage in my dress blues. I thought about every quiet, small moment over 36 years where I had been told in ways large and small that I mattered less. And now I understood. This wasn't new. This was simply the largest, most consequential version of a pattern that had been there since I was old enough to understand the difference between being loved and being tolerated. What surprised me most sitting there in my kitchen with the afternoon light slanting through the window was how calm I felt. I had spent years bracing for a moment like this, some final confirmation of exactly where I stood in my family's hierarchy. And now that it had arrived in the form of a legal document designed to strip me of what was rightfully mine, I didn't feel devastated. I felt something closer to clarity. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I understood exactly what my father wanted, and exactly what he was afraid of. He was afraid of me saying no. He needed my cooperation, my compliance, my old habit of trusting him without question. And he had built an entire document around the assumption that those habits still existed in me. They didn't. Not anymore. What would you like to do? Patricia asked, her voice careful, professional, waiting for direction. I thought about the empty seats at my graduation. I thought about the years of silence I had built for myself, brick by brick, the way you build a wall, not out of hatred, but out of necessity, because the alternative was letting people keep hurting you in the same familiar ways forever. I thought about Daniel outside fixing our fence, about the quiet, steady life we had built together that my father had once called beneath me, and for the first time in 5 years I felt something close to amusement stirring beneath the surface of my calm. I'd like to see how desperate they become, I said. Patricia didn't say anything right away. Then, after a pause, I heard something in her voice that sounded almost like respect. Understood, she said. We won't sign anything. We'll let this play out. I hung up the phone and sat in my kitchen for a long moment staring at the folder Arthur had left behind, at the dense, deliberately confusing language my father had hoped would slip past me, the way so many other things had slipped past me over the years. For the first time since I was a child, standing in that dining room with a certificate no one cared about, I felt like every card in this particular game belonged to me. I didn't feel triumphant, exactly. I felt patient. And somewhere beneath that patience, quiet and steady, I felt something else too, something I hadn't expected to feel again where my family was concerned. I felt ready. The calls started 3 days after I told Patricia to hold off on signing anything. My father's number, still saved in my phone under a name I hadn't looked at in 5 years, lit up my screen 4 times in one afternoon. I let it ring out every time. Then came the texts, short and clipped at first, the way he communicated when he still believed he held all the leverage. "Zoe, call me. This is important. We need to discuss the paperwork." I read them and set the phone face down on the counter, and something in me noticed almost with detachment how familiar this felt, being summoned rather than asked. By the end of the week, the messages had changed tone. Longer, more urgent. My mother started calling too, something she rarely did without my father's prompting. I let those calls go to voicemail as well, though I'll admit the first time I heard her voice crack slightly at the beginning of a message. Something old and tender flickered in my chest before I caught myself and remembered exactly how many of her tears over the years had been reserved for things that mattered far less than a graduation ceremony with 2 empty seats. Emily called on a Tuesday evening while Daniel and I were washing dishes after dinner. I watched her name flash on the screen, felt the corner of my mouth twitch, and let it ring through to voicemail. She called back 4 more times within the hour before finally sending a text. "We need to talk. This affects the whole family, not just you." I didn't respond to any of it. 5 years of silence had taught me that responding even briefly, even out of some old reflexive politeness, only ever opened a door that was easier left closed. It was my father who finally escalated things properly. Arthur called Patricia directly requesting a formal meeting, and my father insisted it happen in person at a restaurant of his, choosing the kind of place with white tablecloths and a wine list, longer than most menus, the kind of place where he had always felt most comfortable performing whatever version of himself the moment required. I agreed to go. Daniel offered to come with me, and part of me wanted him there, wanted the steady warmth of his presence beside me, while I faced my father again for the first time in 5 years. But I told him no. This was something I needed to do alone, the way I had learned slowly and painfully to do most difficult things in my life. My father was already seated when I arrived, a glass of scotch in front of him, his suit pressed to the same sharp precision I remembered from every important dinner of my childhood. He stood when he saw me, offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and gestured for me to sit as though 5 years hadn't passed, as though the last conversation between us hadn't ended with him telling me I was on my own. "You look well," he said, which was, I noted silently, the first thing he'd said to me in half a decade, and it was a comment on my appearance rather than an apology of any kind. "I am well," I said, and left it at that. He tried the soft approach first. He talked about family, about how much he and my mother had missed me, about how time had a way of healing old wounds if people simply let it. He never once mentioned the empty seats at my graduation. He never mentioned the dog's birthday party. He spoke as though the last 5 years had been some unfortunate weather pattern that had simply passed on its own, rather than a silence I had built deliberately brick by brick because of choices he had made. When I didn't respond the way he wanted, his tone shifted the way it always eventually did. "Emily needs this, Zoe," he said, leaning forward slightly. "She hasn't had the advantages you've had, the stability, the career. She needs this trust distribution to get her life on track." "I built my stability myself," I said quietly. "No one handed it to me." "You're already successful," he continued as though I hadn't spoken. "You have your career, your husband." And here his voice dipped slightly, the old familiar condescension surfacing despite his effort to keep it buried. "Your simple little life. Why do you need more?" There it was. The same phrase wearing slightly different clothes, married beneath yourself. Except this time it was dressed up as concern for my sister rather than judgment of my choices. But underneath it was exactly the same sentiment that had followed me through every family gathering for a decade. I was successful enough to not need what was rightfully mine, and Emily was needy enough to deserve what was never rightfully hers. I reached into my bag and set the folder Patricia had prepared on the table between us, the full breakdown of my grandfather's original trust documents, the explicit language protecting equal division, the section my father had hoped I would never read closely enough to understand. I watched something change in his face as he saw it. The polished, patient expression he'd worn since I arrived cracked slightly at the edges, replaced by something sharper, more alert. "Where did you get that?" he said quietly. "I read it," I said. "All of it. Every word grandfather actually wrote, not just the parts you wanted me to see." His jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and I watched him recalculate. Watched him understand finally that the daughter sitting across from him wasn't the same one who used to accept whatever he handed her without question. I stood up before he could recover his composure. "No," I said, "just that, nothing more." And I walked out of that restaurant without looking back, leaving him sitting there with his scotch and his folder, and for the first time in his life, no answer ready at all. The legal letters started arriving within 2 weeks. My father, it turned out, didn't take rejection well, especially not from someone he'd spent 36 years believing he could control simply by controlling the narrative around her. He hired an outside firm separate from Arthur and began what Patricia called an aggressive posture. Filing motions, questioning the validity of my refusal to sign, arguing in dense legal language that my grandfather's original intent had been misinterpreted for decades and needed judicial clarification. Patricia read through each filing with the same patient thoroughness she'd shown from the beginning, and each time she'd call me afterward calm and measured. "He's grasping," she told me once. "These arguments don't hold up against the plain language of the trust. He's hoping the cost and stress of litigation will make you fold before this ever reaches a judge." He didn't understand that I had spent a career training for exactly this kind of pressure. Long deployments teach you things about endurance that don't show up on paper. You learn to function clearly when everything around you is designed to make you panic. You learn that the person who stays calmest usually wins, not because they're smarter, but because panic clouds judgment and clarity survives it. Emily, meanwhile, took a very different approach. She posted about it. Vaguely at first, the kind of cryptic social media post designed to invite sympathy without naming names. Some people only care about money. Family means nothing to some people anymore. Then, less vaguely, a post that named me directly, calling me selfish, accusing me of trying to steal what our grandfather intended for her, of abandoning our family for 5 years, and then swooping back in only when there was money involved. Old friends from high school started reaching out. People I hadn't spoken to in over a decade, suddenly curious, suddenly concerned, asking careful, probing questions dressed up as concern. "Is everything okay with your family?" Emily posted something concerning. I didn't respond to any of it. I had learned slowly and at real cost that explaining yourself to people who had already decided what story they wanted to believe rarely accomplished anything except exhaustion. Instead, Patricia and I let the paperwork speak. Every accusation, every legal maneuver from my father's team was met with documentation. The original trust language. The explicit clause protecting equal distribution. Records showing my father's management fees over the years, fees that upon closer inspection appeared to exceed what the trust's own guidelines allowed him to draw. That last detail, buried in financial statements Patricia's team had subpoenaed, seemed to change something. Arthur called me directly for the first time since our conversation in my kitchen. His voice sounded different this time, tired in a way it hadn't been before. The smooth, professional confidence I remembered from years of watching him work for my father, replaced by something more hesitant. "Zoe," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Okay." "Did you know about the management fee discrepancies before this started?" "No," I said honestly. "My attorney found them during discovery." There was a long pause on his end. "I've represented your father for over 20 years, he said finally quietly. I trusted his account of things when this began. I believed him when he said this was simple paperwork, a formality. Another pause, longer this time. "I don't think that's true anymore." I didn't say anything right away. Some old part of me wanted to feel vindicated, wanted to feel the satisfaction of being believed after years of not being believed. But mostly what I felt was something quieter, more complicated. Arthur wasn't my enemy. He was simply a man who had trusted the wrong person for a very long time, the way I once had. "What made you change your mind?" I asked. "The fee statements," he said. "And something else. He asked me to draft language that would obscure the redistribution clause more heavily after your attorney started asking questions. He wanted it harder to detect on a casual read. I've drafted a lot of documents for your father over the years, Zoe. I've never drafted one meant to deceive a client's own daughter." His voice caught slightly. "I think I need to reconsider my position on this matter entirely." I sat with that for a moment, staring out my kitchen window at Daniel in the yard, patiently teaching our neighbor's kid how to throw a proper spiral with a football, completely unaware of the conversation happening inside. Steady, kind, exactly the kind of person my father had once called beneath me. "Thank you for telling me," I said to Arthur, and I meant it. "I think," Arthur said slowly, "your father lied to me about the nature of this whole request from the very beginning." The final negotiation meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of the building where Arthur's firm had operated for as long as I could remember. My father requested it be held there rather than at Patricia's office, and I understood why the moment I walked in. He wanted home field advantage, the polished mahogany table, the wall of windows overlooking the city, the entire performance of power that had always been his preferred language. He arrived exactly on time, dressed impeccably, carrying himself with the same confident posture I'd watched my whole life, the posture of a man who had never once doubted that things would eventually go his way. Emily sat beside him, arms crossed, refusing to look directly at me. My mother wasn't there. I noticed that immediately, and something in me understood that she had likely chosen once again to remove herself from the uncomfortable parts of family conflict, the way she always had. Arthur sat at the head of the table, and I noticed how different he looked from the man who had first walked into my kitchen months earlier. Quieter, more careful. He barely made eye contact with my father when he sat down, and I understood watching the small distance between them that whatever loyalty had existed between these two men for over 20 years had begun to erode in a way that couldn't easily be repaired. My father opened the meeting with confidence the way he opened every meeting of his life, certain that his presence alone would tilt the room in his favor. "I think we can resolve this quickly," he said, sliding a revised document across the table toward me. "I've had my team draft a final version, reasonable, fair to everyone involved." I picked it up and began reading Patricia beside me, quiet and watchful. The document was different from the first one, more carefully worded, dressed in softer legal language, but the underlying structure was the same. A redistribution. A restructuring. My father, it seemed, hadn't been able to resist adding one more layer of protection for himself this time, a clause granting him continued authority over distribution timing and asset management decisions. Even after the redistribution took effect, language designed to keep his hand on the trust indefinitely, regardless of what happened between me and Emily. I read it once. Then I read it again more slowly. And something in the second read caught my attention, a phrase buried in a subordinate clause on the third-page language my father had clearly added himself, believing it strengthened his position. I felt it before I fully understood it, the way you sometimes feel the shape of a joke before you've consciously worked out the punchline. I read the clause a third time to be certain, cross-referencing it silently against what I remembered from the original trust document, the one my grandfather had written decades earlier, the one Patricia and I had studied so carefully. And then I laughed. Not a polite, restrained laugh. A real one, the kind that catches you by surprise and builds before you can stop it, the kind that made Arthur sit up straight, and my father's jaw visibly tighten across the table. "Did I miss something?" Arthur asked, genuinely confused, glancing between me and the document as though trying to locate whatever I'd found. I turned the folder around and slid it across the table toward him, tapping the clause with one finger, still fighting to steady my breathing. "He wrote this himself, didn't he?" I said. "This exact language right here." Arthur read it carefully, his eyes moving across the page once then again, and I watched the exact moment understanding hit him because his whole posture changed, his shoulders, dropping slightly, his mouth opening as though to speak before closing again. My father, it turned out, in his eagerness to secure permanent control over the trust, regardless of how the redistribution played out, had added a clause granting himself ongoing management authority that directly contradicted a specific ironclad provision in my grandfather's original document, a provision that explicitly stated that any attempt to grant the trustee authority beyond distribution execution would void the trustee's role entirely and trigger immediate, full distribution to beneficiaries under the original equal terms. He hadn't just failed to take more from me. He had accidentally triggered the exact clause that guaranteed I would receive my full original share immediately, with no further trustee involvement from him at all. In trying to secure permanent control, he had written himself completely out of the equation, and in doing so, restored the trust to precisely the equal division my grandfather had always intended. Arthur set the document down slowly, his face pale. "He's not getting any of it," he said quietly, almost to himself, as though he could barely believe the words as he said them. My father snatched the document back, scanning it frantically, his composure finally completely cracking. This is a clerical error, this isn't what I intended." "It's exactly what you wrote," Arthur said, and there was something final in his voice, something that told me this conversation and this friendship of 20 years had reached its true ending point. "I told you not to add that clause without letting me review it first. You insisted on handling it yourself." Emily looked between the two of them, utterly lost, still not understanding what had just happened, still waiting for someone to explain how this had gone so wrong so quickly. My father sat there, folder in his shaking hands, the color draining slowly from his face, undone entirely by his own greed, by his own inability to simply let things stay equal the way his father had always intended. I sat back in my chair, still catching my breath from laughing, and felt something settle inside me that I hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter and far more satisfying. The judge finalized the distribution 6 weeks later, and it happened almost quietly, the way real endings often do, without the drama or spectacle that had defined every other chapter of this story. My father's clause had been exactly what Arthur said. It was a fatal self-inflicted error, and the court upheld my grandfather's original trust language without hesitation. Equal division. No trustee discretion left to exercise. No more room for anyone to quietly tilt the scales in one direction or another ever again. Richard lost completely. And I want to be honest about something here. I didn't feel the satisfaction I expected to feel. I thought somewhere in the back of my mind that watching him lose would feel like justice, finally arriving loud and complete. Instead, it felt strangely small, almost anticlimactic, the way real endings to long conflicts often do. He wasn't a villain in a story anymore. He was just a tired older man who had spent his whole life mistaking control for love and had finally run out of ways to disguise the difference. Emily called me once about a month after everything settled. Her voice was different than I remembered, quieter, less certain of itself. She didn't apologize exactly, not fully, but she said something close to it. Something about realizing she'd never actually had to build anything for herself, and not knowing what that meant about her, now that the safety net had finally permanently disappeared. I listened. I didn't offer forgiveness I didn't feel yet, but I didn't hang up on her either. Some doors, I've learned, don't need to be slammed shut. They can simply be left slightly ajar for whatever future version of a relationship might eventually walk through them, if it ever does. My father asked to meet with me twice after the ruling. Both times I declined. Not out of cruelty and not even entirely out of anger anymore. I declined because I finally understood something that had taken me 36 years and one dog's birthday party to learn. Closure doesn't always require a conversation. Sometimes it simply requires the decision to stop waiting for one. With my share of the trust finally distributed, the way my grandfather had always intended, I made choices that felt more like me than anything my family had ever pushed me toward. I established a scholarship fund for children of active duty service members, kids who move every 2 years and rebuild their entire lives over and over without ever being asked if that's what they wanted. I contributed to a program supporting families who had lost a service member, the ones who carry a grief that never fully resolves, only reshapes itself over time. And because Daniel had spent over a decade pouring himself into a profession that paid him far less than he deserved, and gave far more than most people ever notice, I donated a significant portion toward teacher training programs, the quiet, unglamorous work of shaping young minds that so rarely gets celebrated the way it should. None of it was about proving anything to my father. That part of me, the part that spent years hoping my achievements might finally earn his approval, had died somewhere between an empty seat at my graduation and a dog's birthday cake with white frosting. What I built instead was simply an extension of the life Daniel and I had already created together, quiet and steady, and entirely our own. I still think about that ceremony sometimes, standing in my dress blues, scanning the crowd for two faces that never appeared. I used to think about it with a tight, aching feeling in my chest. Now when it comes to mind, it feels more like remembering an old photograph of someone I used to be, someone who still needed something from people who were never going to give it. Daniel and I stood in our backyard the evening after the final paperwork was signed. Nothing dramatic about the moment, just the two of us in the fading light, the fence he'd repaired, standing steady behind us, a cup of coffee warm in my hands. No mansion, no extravagant parties. Just the quiet, ordinary peace we had built for ourselves, brick by brick, the same patient way I'd once learned to build anything worth having. "You okay?" Daniel asked, watching me the way he always did, carefully, like my answer actually mattered to him. "I'm good," I said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I meant it completely. The funniest part of this whole story isn't that my father lost. It's that he spent 5 years believing I still wanted his approval, still needed him to finally see me the way he'd always seen my sister. The truth is, I'd stopped needing that, the exact night he chose a dog's birthday over his own daughter's graduation. Everything that came after was simply him finding out one legal document at a time, exactly how long ago that door had already closed. If you've made it this far with me, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to walk away from people who were supposed to love you unconditionally just to finally feel like yourself again? I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight, and whether any part of this story felt familiar to you. Leave a comment below and let me know. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you, So if this kept you company today, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Let's keep walking this road together.